Welcome to Attic Static. Tonight we have 17 stories for you, including the draft of the discarded room, the percussion of the third floor, the shadow of the static house, and more. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the rain carry you. The draft of the discarded room. I am the one who sits in the high-backed chair, the one who holds the heavy brass bell and the worn notebook. My sister is gone, but the house still feels as though it is holding her breath. The silence after her funeral wasn't empty. It was heavy, a physical layer of dust settling over every surface. Then, on a Tuesday, the nursery began to breathe. It wasn't a literal expansion of lungs, but a sudden, violent reorganization of the air. The atmosphere curdled, weighted by a peculiar pressure, as if a body were standing just out of sight, leaning its weight against the very fabric of the room. I sat in the center of the floor, spine straight, ears straining. I dropped my voice into the stillness like a pebble into a well. "Are you here?" I whispered. For 3 days, there was only a low-frequency thrum, a vibration in the floorboards like the purr of a cat buried deep beneath the wood. Then came the draft. It didn't blow from the window or seep from the door. It erupted from a corner where no wall existed, a spatial hiccup from a room torn out of the house's blueprints years ago, a discarded space. It hit my shoulder like a physical push. It was a cool, steady pressure, the sensation of a forehead pressed against my spine. It carried the scent of old linen and crushed violets, the exact ghost of her favorite shawl. One evening, the pressure intensified. It wasn't a breeze anymore. It was a deliberate lean. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I could feel the proximity of a body in a space that was entirely empty. It was a hug, but a strange one, a hug from a room that no longer had a name. I felt her invisible ribs press against my shoulder blades. The draft began to wander. The pressure migrated from my shoulder to my side, circling me like a slow, predatory embrace. It felt as if the discarded room was reaching out, trying to pull me into its forgotten dimensions. I closed my eyes. "Is it you, Alara?" The draft shuddered. The pressure tightened, pulling inward. It felt as though she were leaning in to whisper, her invisible nose brushing my ear, her breath cooling the skin of my temple. The air grew sharp, biting at my senses. The missing room was folding itself into the nursery, collapsing into our space to claim its territory. I felt her arms wrap around my waist, not as flesh and bone, but as a tightening of the atmosphere, a squeeze of the air itself. It was the way she used to hold me when we were children, her chin tucked into my hair. The pressure became immense, the walls of the room seemingly shrinking to accommodate the intimacy of the moment. Then, the pressure vanished. The silence that followed was ringing, vibrating in the marrow of my bones. I reached into the empty space where she had leaned. My fingers trembled. I expected nothingness, but found a lingering warmth, a faint heat trapped in the air like steam from a cup of tea. She wasn't just visiting, she was staying, tucked into the fold of the house, a permanent resident of the discarded space. I sat for an hour, watching the dust motes dance in the moonlight. She wasn't a spirit wandering the halls like a tourist. She was the weight of a memory that refused to let go, a permanent fixture in the architecture of my mind. I stood up to leave, my joints creaking in the quiet. As I turned toward the door, the pressure returned for a fraction of a second, a sharp, sudden nudge against my ribs. She wasn't leaning from behind anymore. She was leaning in from the side, watching me go. I am the one who sits in the high-backed chair, the one who holds the heavy brass bell and the worn notebook. The percussion of the third floor. To the night shift crew taking over, please do not be alarmed by the silence of the elevator when it stops between the second and third floors at exactly 3:14 a.m. It is not a mechanical failure. It is a transition. I have spent 3 weeks monitoring the behavior of the entity that lives in the shaft, and I am handing my shift over to you because I can no longer endure its rhythmic demands. It began on my first night. I was hauling a tray of linens when the lift gave a shudder and groaned into a halt. The lights flickered once and died, leaving us in a thick, pressurized gloom. Then I heard it. A sharp, woody click against the metal wall to my left. It wasn't a voice, but a percussion. It was the sound of a felt-tipped mallet striking a taut string, producing a clear, resonant note. Then came another, and another. It was tapping my name, Elias, one syllable at a time, the notes echoing off the brass railings. By the second night, the sound became more frequent. I realized the entity wasn't just hitting the walls, it was moving. When the elevator stalled, the sensation of something heavy and multi-limbed would slide across the ceiling. It felt like a cluster of dozens of wooden hammers, each tipped with a tuft of soft wool, dancing in the dark. It didn't have a face to look at me, nor did it have a body in the traditional sense. It was a floating constellation of hammers, connected by invisible cords of tension, swaying like a cluster of grapes made of mahogany and felt. It didn't just tap, it played. It found the resonance of the metal box and turned my name into a melody, a steady, staccato beat that vibrated in my teeth. However, the most unsettling part of my shift was the chalk mark. Every morning, when the sun began to peek through the high windows of the lobby, I would find a single, perfectly circular mark of white chalk on the floor directly in front of the elevator doors. It appeared as if something had leaned against the door and pressed a single hammer tip against the tile. On the first day, it was a faint smudge. On the 5th day, it was a sharp, crisp ring. On the 10th day, the mark grew larger, as if the entity were pressing harder, trying to communicate the weight of its existence. Last night was the breaking point. The elevator stalled at 3:14 a.m., as it always does. The air grew colder, smelling of old wood and rosin. I sat on the floor, my heart hammering against my ribs. The entity descended from the ceiling, a swarm of mahogany hammers swirling like a school of fish. It didn't just tap my name this time. It played a frantic, rapid-fire trill of Elias, the hammer striking with such velocity that the felt tips began to hum. Then, the entity did something it had never done before. It stopped tapping the walls. It moved toward me. I could feel the soft wool of the hammers brushing against my shoulders, a gentle, repetitive thrumming that felt like a dozen tiny hearts beating against my skin. It leaned in, and I felt the pressure of a single, heavy hammer pressing against my forehead, holding me perfectly still. It stayed there for a full minute, a heavy, wooden weight of concentration. Then it retreated to the ceiling, and the elevator lurched upward, finally reaching the 3rd floor with a triumphant jingle. When I stepped out into the hallway, the chalk mark was waiting. It was no longer a circle. It had been transformed into a perfect, jagged X, as if the entity had finally decided to leave its signature. I am leaving my keys on the console. You will hear it. You will feel the wood against your skin. Just remember, when the hammers start to strike, do not try to catch them. They are simply trying to remember your name. But as I walked away, I realized the mark on the floor hadn't faded. It was still there, and as I looked back, I saw a second mark forming next to it, smaller and fainter, as if something else were waiting for its turn to be noticed. The shadow of the static house. I moved into the model home at the very edge of Willow Creek because it was the cheapest option in a subdivision that felt more like a skeleton than a neighborhood. The houses were half-finished, skeletons of timber and drywall standing in rows, waiting for the humans to arrive. My home was a masterpiece of pristine beige, yet it felt lonely in the middle of the construction dust. For the first week, the only inhabitant was a small, vibrant songbird that had nested in the eaves of the porch. It was a tiny thing with feathers the color of wet asphalt, and it spent its days perfecting a melody that felt oddly rhythmic, almost deliberate. But as the second week bled into the third, the bird began to do something strange. It stopped singing its natural trills and started to mimic a voice. It wasn't just a human sound, it was my mother's voice. She had passed away 3 years ago, and the bird would let out a clear, melodic, "Is it time yet?" every morning at 6 a.m. At first, I laughed, thinking it a coincidence of nature. But the bird didn't just mimic the tone, it captured the specific, weary lilt she had when she was looking for her keys. The deeper the bird learned the voice, the more the house seemed to change. I started noticing a peculiar anomaly in the living room. Every time I moved the lamp across the coffee table, the shadow it cast didn't just move with the light. It lingered. When I swung the lamp to the left, the shadow stayed on the right, a stubborn patch of darkness that refused to vacate its original throne. It looked like a puddle of spilled ink, but it had texture, ripples on the surface that moved like slow-motion waves in a pond. It wasn't a silhouette of an object, it was a physical weight in the air. By the second month, the shadow became more distinct. It grew jagged edges, looking less like a pool and more like a heavy velvet cloth thrown onto the floor. It had a peculiar behavior. It would pulse. Whenever the bird mimicked my mother's voice, the shadow would ripple, expanding outward as if the sound were feeding it. I began to realize that the shadow wasn't just left behind by the light, it was a parasite of the light. It fed on the illumination until the source moved on. One Tuesday, I was sitting in the armchair, reading by the glow of a single floor lamp. The bird perched on the mantel, its tiny beak opening to release a perfect, heartbreaking "Don't forget me." As the words hung in the air, the shadow beneath the table suddenly surged. It didn't just stay where the lamp had been, it crawled. It moved like a slow, viscous tide, creeping toward my feet. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. The shadow wasn't a flat shape anymore. It had gained depth, becoming a thick, bubbling mass of darkness that felt cold to the touch. It reached my slippers and began to hum a low, vibrating resonance that matched the bird's song. I realized then that the shadow wasn't just a byproduct of the lamp. It was a predator of the space the light had touched. It was collecting the moments. That night, I sat in total darkness, watching the bird. It chirped once, a tiny, lonely sound. The shadow, which had been resting in the corner, suddenly surged forward, covering the floor, the walls, and eventually the ceiling. It didn't move with the flicker of my heartbeat. It moved with the intent of an appetite. It swallowed the furniture, the bird, and finally, the air itself. I felt the shadow press against my chest, heavy and cool, like a wet blanket of midnight. It wasn't just a patch of darkness anymore. It was a physical presence that felt like it was trying to remember what it felt like to be solid. When the sun rose the next morning, the shadow was gone, having finally finished its meal of the room's light. I stepped out onto the porch to find the bird sitting on the railing, its feathers slightly ruffled. It opened its beak and let out a perfect, crystal-clear replica of my mother's final sigh. I looked down at the floor of the porch where the shadow had last been, and noticed a small, permanent smudge of darkness that refused to fade even in the bright morning sun. It was a tiny, thumb-shaped mark, perfectly still, as if it were waiting for me to stop looking at it. The Wayward Route. The fire lookout tower was supposed to be my sanctuary, a solitary wooden spire perched above a sea of pine needles. For 3 days, I lived in the rhythmic cycle of brewing coffee, watching the smoke plumes rise and scanning the horizon for the orange flicker of a new flame. It was only when I decided to explore the dense thicket to the east that the map app on my phone began to behave strangely. At first, it was a minor glitch. I tapped the icon for the Hidden Creek Trail, but the blue line hesitated, then pivoted sharply toward a dense cluster of oaks that shouldn't have been on the primary path. Every time I tried to correct the course, the app would hum with a low, vibrating frequency and force my thumb toward that same cluster. I eventually reached it and found a house, a lopsided, 2-story structure with shutters that looked like heavy eyelids. It wasn't on any of my physical maps. I shrugged it off as a local landmark and headed back, but the app was already pulsing, rerouting me toward the house again. By the second hour, I was practically sprinting. The map didn't care about my desire to reach the creek. It insisted on the house. It felt less like a navigation tool and more like a hungry mouth, pulling me toward the same destination over and over. When I finally reached the front porch, the silence was heavy. I didn't want to go inside, but the app showed a bright gold pin hovering over the front door. I stepped into the foyer. It was dust-choked and smelled of old cedar. That is when I saw it in the hallway. I wasn't alone. Standing near a crooked coat rack was a figure that looked almost exactly like me. It was my reflection, yet it wasn't mirrored in a piece of glass. It stood independently in the air. It was a few inches taller than my own height, with a torso that seemed slightly broader. Its skin had the texture of crushed velvet, and its hair was a thick, unruly mane of copper wires. Most unsettling was its posture. While I stood still, the reflection leaned forward with an eagerness that felt almost predatory, its shoulders hunched as if it were trying to squeeze into my personal space. It didn't just mimic my face, it anticipated my movements by a fraction of a second. When I blinked, it blinked first. When I took a breath, it inhaled with a sharp, audible hiss. I took a step back, and the reflection surged forward, its face stretching into a wide, toothy grin that felt slightly too large for its jaw. It wasn't just copying me, it was enjoying the process of imitating me. It moved with a fluid, liquid grace, its limbs swaying as if it were underwater. It reached out a hand, not a thin hand, but a broad, palm-heavy limb, and hovered at inches from my chest. I realized then that it wasn't just a shadow of my existence, it was a hungry version of myself, waiting for its turn to take the lead. The map app on my phone chirped once, the gold pin finally vanishing. I felt a sudden, violent pull, as if the house itself were exhaling. The reflection didn't wait for me to move. It lunged, its velvet skin rippling, and its hand finally touched my shoulder. It was ice cold. In that moment, the house grew silent, the air pressure shifted, and the reflection stepped into my space, occupying my body with a seamless, suffocating transition. I felt my consciousness slide into the background, becoming the observer of my own limbs. The reflection, now my body, stood upright and looked around the room with wide, bright eyes. It reached out and touched the wall, then looked back at me, who was now the one standing slightly behind it. I realized with a jolt of terror that I was no longer the primary occupant of my own skin. The reflection took a deep breath, its chest swelling, and it gave me a small, satisfied nod. It began to walk toward the door, moving with a new, confident swagger. I followed, my own body trailing behind like a ghost. As it reached the threshold, it stopped and turned to look at me one last time. It didn't just stand there, it leaned in, its face inches from mine, and its velvet skin hummed with a low vibration. It didn't just want to be me, it wanted to keep me. It stepped out into the yard, and as the door swung shut behind us, I felt the house settle into a deep, satisfied slumber. The map app on the floor flickered one last time, the route finally complete, but the gold pin didn't disappear. It moved, traveling along the path toward the forest, following the thing that now wore my face. The revision of the Looming chord. The snow had finally claimed the lower meadows, burying the Alpine refuge under a suffocating blanket of white. We were the last two souls left in the timber frame hut, the final hikers to survive the autumn transition. I sat by the hearth, watching the embers die, while my husband, Elias, sat opposite me. The silence was thick, broken only by the rhythmic crackle of pine wood. It was during the third night of our isolation that I noticed the discrepancy. Elias reached for a mug of tea, and as his arm moved, his shadow didn't follow. It lagged by a fraction of a second, then stretched into a shape that didn't belong to him. It wasn't a human silhouette, it was a jagged, uneven protrusion that seemed to have more weight than his physical body. "Do you see it?" I whispered, my breath blooming in the frigid air. Elias looked at the floor. "See what?" "Your shadow. It's wider than your shoulders." He frowned, but as he moved his head, the shadow stayed perfectly still for a beat before snapping into place. It was as if his shadow was a stubborn fabric being pulled across the floor by an invisible hand. By the fourth night, the shadow began to change texture. It stopped being a flat projection and started to look frayed at the edges, like a woven tapestry that had been pulled apart by a rough grip. It grew thicker, developing a slight fuzziness that caught the light of the lanterns. Then, the hum began. It wasn't a sound heard with the ears so much as a vibration felt in the teeth. It was the sound of something searching. I found it on the fifth night, crawling along the rafters. It wasn't a ghost or a spirit in the traditional sense. It was a mass of tangled charging cords, thousands of them, woven into a dense, pulsating nest. Some were thick and braided like heavy rope, others were thin and frayed like stray threads of silk. The entity didn't have a face, but it had a pulse. One end of the tangle was perpetually warm, radiating a steady, comforting heat that smelled faintly of toasted ozone. The other end was cold and sharp, tapering into a multitude of tiny, needle-like tips that twitched constantly. It was the reason for the shadow. The entity was weaving itself into Elias. Every time he slept, the tangle would move closer. It didn't walk, It flowed, a river of copper and nylon winding through the air. It would wrap a few strands around his ribcage, then retreat to the ceiling to find more room. By the 7th day, Elias had stopped moving much. He stayed seated in his chair, his body becoming a scaffold for the growing web. The entity was searching for a way to anchor itself to his heartbeat. "It's getting heavier," Elias murmured on the 8th night. His voice sounded muffled, as if he were speaking from inside a cavern. I reached out to touch the nearest chord. It was smooth and slightly tacky, like a river stone. As my skin met the weave, the entire mass shuddered. A ripple of heat surged through the tangle, and the needle tips at the far end clattered against the wooden floor like 100 tiny fingernails. "It wants to be part of you," I said, watching the shadow on the wall. It was no longer a silhouette of a man. It was a complex, intricate map of overlapping lines, a geometric web that pulsed with every breath Elias took. On the final night, the transformation reached its zenith. The entity had finished its search. It had woven itself into the very marrow of his bones. Elias stood up, and for a moment, he was perfectly still. Then, the tangle surged forward, wrapping around his torso like a second skin of braided wire. It didn't just sit on him, it integrated with him. His skin took on the slight sheen of polished copper, and his hair became a soft, fuzzy fringe of tiny fibers. He looked at me, his eyes reflecting the amber glow of the dying fire. He opened his mouth to speak, but instead of a word, a soft, melodic hum escaped his throat, the sound of 1,000 wires vibrating in harmony. He was no longer just a man. He was a vessel for the weave. He reached out a hand, and as he touched my cheek, I felt the heat of the core and the sharp prick of the needles. He was complete. The shadow on the wall was a perfect, complex masterpiece of tangled lines, reaching out toward me. I realized then that the entity wasn't just inhabiting him, it was recording him, turning his every movement into a permanent stitch in its eternal fabric. He smiled, but his shadow didn't move until he had finished, and even then, it remained a shape that looked less like a man and more like a nest of wires waiting for a new thread to be pulled through. The margin of the threshold. The nursing home felt heavy with the scent of lavender and old linen, but during the storm, it took on a denser, more suffocating quality. I was assigned to the dementia wing, a place where time doesn't move in a straight line. The residents often wandered as if navigating a labyrinth, and I found myself tasked with keeping them grounded. One Tuesday, the rain lashed against the tall windows in rhythmic thuds, turning the hallways into dim, oceanic tunnels. I was carrying a tray of tea when I noticed it, a door that hadn't been there the previous evening. It was tucked between the communal lounge and room 14, a heavy slab of oak with a rusted iron handle. It felt out of place, as if the architecture had simply exhaled and produced a new limb. I stood before it for a moment, wondering if the residents had hallucinated it collectively, or if the building itself was growing. I decided to investigate, pressing my palm against the wood. It was colder than the rest of the wall, vibrating with a low, subaudible hum. From beneath the door, a strange substance began to seep. It wasn't water, nor was it shadow. It was a thick, viscous pool of something that looked like molten silk, shifting in hue from deep indigo to a bruised plum. It didn't just sit there, it pulsed. It was the entity that lived behind the wood, a boneless creature that had lost its skeleton to the weight of its own thought. It didn't have limbs in the traditional sense, but rather undulating folds of velvet-textured flesh that rippled like a jellyfish caught in a slow current. It moved with a rhythmic, sucking sound, tasting the air of the hallway. I sat in a chair nearby, pulled a second-hand book of poetry from my pocket, and began to read. The book was a relic of a previous nurse, and its margins were crowded with her frantic handwriting. I traced her notes with my thumb as the door groaned. On page 12, her script was shaky. The door arrived at noon. It has a taste for the quiet. On page 20, she had written, "It is not a beast of muscle, but a beast of intent. It pulls like spilled ink, yet it remembers the shape of things." As the storm intensified, the pool beneath the door expanded. The boneless thing began to push its way out, not by walking, but by flowing. It squeezed through the crack like a river of heavy cream, spreading across the linoleum floor. It didn't have a face, but it had a sense of presence. It moved toward my feet, the indigo silk rippling over the floorboards. I could feel it sensing my heartbeat. It was a slow, deliberate crawl. I realized then that the entity wasn't just moving, it was reacting to my thoughts. Every time I felt a flicker of fear, a fold of its body would arch upward, mimicking a ripple in a pond. It was a creature of pure, boneless awareness. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the top of the pool. It felt like cool, wet velvet, and it squeezed against my palm with a gentle, insistent pressure. It wasn't trying to grab me, it was trying to understand what a hand was. The humming grew louder, a melodic thrum that resonated in my chest. The air grew thick with the smell of wet stone and ozone. I looked at the margin note on the final page of the book, where the previous owner's handwriting had become almost illegible, a frantic scrawl of ink. Do not let it find your shadow, for once it pulls over your feet, it begins to weave your name into its own. The creature surged forward, covering my shoes entirely, the indigo silk wrapping around my ankles like a heavy, warm cloak. It wasn't just a spill of matter, it was a lingering thought made physical. I realized the door wasn't a gateway to another room, but a gateway to the entity's own internal world. The door was the mouth, and the hallway was its stomach. I sat perfectly still as the boneless thing rose higher, its velvet folds beginning to climb my legs, seeking the warmth of my skin. It moved with a grace that defied anatomy, flowing over my knees and settling at my waist. It felt as though it were trying to fold itself into me, a piece of living fabric seeking a home. I closed my eyes, and the hum reached a crescendo, a single, pure note that seemed to vibrate the very bones of my body. Then the movement stopped. The entity settled into a perfect, shimmering pool around my hips, its indigo surface reflecting the dim light of the hallway. The door behind me gave a final, satisfying click as it swung shut of its own accord, sealing the creature inside with me. I took a deep breath, feeling the velvet weight of its presence, and realized that while the door was closed, the entity was no longer just beneath it. It was part of me now, and I could feel it beginning to pulse against my ribs, waiting for the next time I dared to open the door and let it out. The guest who remained. Please, everyone, hold your glasses for just a moment. I know what the seating chart says. I am the last person you expected to hear from tonight, the one you politely whispered about when I walked through the door. But since the champagne is flowing and the silence is heavy, I figured it was time to tell you why I stayed at the summit for so long. My job was simple. I was to be the sole keeper of the High Peak Observatory. It is a lonely, brutal place, a jagged volcanic tooth piercing the clouds, where the air is thin and the silence is so thick it feels like a physical weight against your eardrums. I spent 6 months there, alone with the hum of the machines and the vast, indifferent sweep of the cosmos. But the isolation wasn't what eventually broke me. It was the camera. It was a standard security unit, mounted on a swivel at the far end of the sleeping quarters. In the beginning, it was my only companion. It watched me work, watched me eat, and watched me sleep. But on the 14th night, the first shift happened. I was sitting at my desk, sketching a map of the constellations, and I felt a prickle on the back of my neck. I looked up. The camera, which had been pointed toward the door, had rotated exactly 45 degrees to face my profile. I blinked, thinking the gears were just settling. Then I turned to reach for my coffee. When I looked back, the camera had pivoted again. It was now watching my hands. By the 3rd week, the shift became constant. No matter where I moved, no matter how quickly I shifted my weight, the lens followed. It didn't just track my movement, it seemed to anticipate it. It would swivel toward a corner just before I turned to look there. It felt like a steady, mechanical gaze, a silent audience of one. I began to feel less like a scientist and more like a performer on a stage. I started to move with more intention, trying to outsmart the lens, but the camera always won. It would swivel with a soft, rhythmic click-clack, its frame narrowing until I was perfectly centered. And then, the nights became the strangest part. I would climb into my bunk, the heavy wool blankets pulled up to my chin. The camera would follow me into bed, its lens hovering just above my pillow. I would fall asleep, and the observatory would fall into a deep, humming silence. Then, in the middle of the night, I would feel it. I would feel the weight of the sheets change. It wasn't a heavy weight, but a subtle shifting of pressure, as if something was filling the hollow of my body. I would wake up in the deepest part of the night, my breath hitching in my throat. The sheets were no longer flat where I had been lying. They were slightly indented, as if a body had just occupied my ribs and my hips. I would turn my head, expecting to see a person, but the room would be empty. Except for the camera. It would be pointed directly at my face, its lens wide and unblinking. One morning, I woke up and realized I hadn't moved at all, yet the center of the bed was warm. It wasn't just a lingering heat, it was a radiant, pulsing warmth, like a stone left in the sun. It was the heat of a living thing. I finally gathered the courage to stay awake. I lay perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs. Around 3 a.m., I felt it. A sensation of velvet-soft texture pressed against my shoulder. It wasn't a hand, but something smoother, like a wet river stone. Then a hum, not from the machines, but from the bed itself. A low, vibrating frequency that resonated in my teeth. I squeezed my eyes shut, terrified to see it. I felt the warmth migrate from my chest to my side, a slow, creeping heat that felt like a heavy blanket of liquid gold. It felt as though something was molding itself into the shape of my torso, perfectly filling the space my spine had left behind. It had a texture like crushed silk and smelled faintly of ozone and toasted almonds. It was settling into my impression, claiming the space I had vacated. In the morning, I sat up and looked at the camera. It was no longer watching me. It was pointed at the empty center of the bed, as if it were watching something that was no longer there. I realized then that the camera wasn't just following me. It was waiting for me to leave so the visitor could take my place. I packed my bags in a fever of haste, not wanting to linger a second longer. I ran down the volcanic slope, the wind whipping my hair, the observatory shrinking behind me. I still see that camera in my dreams. I still feel that warmth in my bones. But every time I lie down in my own bed now, I find myself reaching out to see if the space next to me is still occupied. I realize now that I didn't just share the bed with something. I gave it my shape. I am still in that room, and the entity is still there, perfectly warm, waiting for the next time I close my eyes to see if I will finally let it out. The inventory of the unclaimed. The silence of an empty call center is not a true silence. It is a heavy, pressurized hum of potential. When the last agent logs off, the hundreds of workstations become a graveyard of plastic and wire, waiting for voices that are no longer there. I stayed behind on a Tuesday, tasked with the final sweep of the night shift. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed in a steady B-flat, casting a sterile glow over the rows of ergonomic chairs. I liked the solitude of it. It felt as though the building was holding its breath, exhaling the echoes of 1,000 human sighs. I sat at my desk in the far corner, my own headset resting on the laminate surface, and took a deep breath of the air-conditioned stillness. That was when I noticed the first anomaly in the crowd. From the opposite end of the hall, a figure emerged from the shadows of the cubicles. It didn't walk so much as it glided, moving with a rhythmic, swaying motion. It was a singular entity, but its anatomy was a beautiful, impossible contradiction. The upper half of its body belonged to a towering, broad-shouldered giant, while the lower half was that of a small, nimble creature. Its torso was thick and muscular, topped with a head that possessed a heavy jawline and a crown of thick, unruly hair. However, its legs were short and delicate, ending in wide, padded feet that made no sound on the linoleum. It moved like a person trying to carry a massive oak tree on top of a fleet of racing bicycles. It stopped 10 feet away from my desk and simply stood there, its upper body towering over the rows of chairs, while its lower body seemed to tuck neatly into the gaps between the desk legs. It didn't speak, but I felt its presence, a weight in the air, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. I reached for my pen, my hand trembling slightly. "Are you here to help with the inventory?" I whispered, my voice feeling too loud in the vacuum of the room. The entity didn't move its mouth, but a voice vibrated in the air around my ears, sounding like two different instruments playing the same note. "I am here to settle the accounts," it hummed. It began to move toward me, its large upper body swaying precariously over its small, sturdy legs. As it drew closer, the lighting caught its face. It was my face. Not a likeness, but my actual face, the slight crook in my nose, the specific way my eyebrows knit together when I was concentrated, the tiny mole just above my chin. Yet, it was a face I had never owned. It was the face of a person who had lived a life I hadn't lived, wearing my features like a borrowed coat. The entity reached out with a hand that was larger than my own, its palm wide and textured like weathered leather. It held out a small, wooden music box that I had never seen before. "Take this," it said, its voice resonating in my chest. It was a gift from a mother who never lived in this city, yet I have carried it for a century. I took it, the wood feeling warm and pulse-like against my skin. I didn't know where it came from, but it felt like a heavy weight had been lifted from the entity's shoulders. It moved again, its large torso leaning forward as its small legs scurried with newfound speed. It held out a tarnished brass key. "This belongs to a door that hasn't been built yet," it whispered. "I am tired of carrying the weight of a room that does not exist." I took the key, and the entity seemed to shrink slightly, its broad shoulders relaxing. It was a process of divestment. The figure was bequeathing things that were never mine to give away, emptying its own internal warehouse into my hands. It offered a smooth river stone, a bundle of dried lavender, and a heavy iron ring. With each gift, the entity grew lighter, its movements becoming more fluid, less of a struggle against gravity. It reached the final item, a small, glass vial filled with a shimmering, golden sand. "This is the most difficult one," the entity said, its face, my face, stretching into a sad, knowing smile. "It is the memory of a first kiss from a girl whose name I have forgotten. It is too heavy for me to keep alone." As I took the vial, the entity let out a long, weary sigh. Its large upper body began to shimmer and blur at the edges, the colors of its hair fading into the gray of the walls. Its small legs gave one final, synchronized twitch. Then it began to dissolve. It didn't crumble. It simply unfolded like a piece of paper being smoothed out. The large torso melted into the air, and the small legs evaporated into a fine mist. Within seconds, the entity was gone, leaving nothing behind but the objects it had surrendered. I sat in the silence, surrounded by the music box, the key, the stone, the lavender, the ring, and the sand. The call center was perfectly still again. I looked down at my hands, still holding the golden sand. I realized that the entity hadn't just given me objects, it had traded its identity for my space. I stood up to leave, my chair scraping softly against the floor. I reached for the light switch, but before I flipped it, I noticed something in the center of the room. In the spot where the entity had stood, there was a faint, lingering impression on the floor, a perfect shadow of its impossible shape. I turned to walk toward the exit, but as I passed my own desk, I saw my reflection in the glass of the partition. For a split second, my own face flickered, and for one heartbeat, my eyes weren't my own. They were the eyes of the entity, wide and ancient, watching me from inside my own skin. The proximity of the smiling frame. Entry 1, Tuesday, 11:42 p.m. I chose level 4 of the parking garage because it is the quietest. The concrete smells of damp minerals and old exhaust. I parked my sedan in slot 112, which is a generous amount of space from the heavy metal door of the elevator. It felt safe. The lights are hummed dim, casting amber pools on the floor. I am exhausted, but the silence feels heavy, like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. Entry 2, Wednesday, 11:45 p.m. I return to the same spot. My car is still in slot 112. However, as I stepped out, I noticed a small, rectangular object resting on the hood of my vehicle. It is a framed photograph. The frame is a heavy, tarnished bronze. Inside the frame is a family of 4, a father, a mother, a son, and a daughter. They are all standing in a garden, but their smiles are peculiar. Their mouths are stretched wide, showing a row of teeth that seem just a fraction too numerous, as if they are trying to fit an extra set into their gums. It feels like a smile that is held for a second too long. Entry 3, Thursday, 11:50 p.m. I parked in slot 112 again. The photograph is still there. It has moved from the hood to the windshield, angled slightly toward the driver's side. I noticed something strange about the father in the photo. In the previous night's entry, his smile was wide. Tonight, his teeth seem to have elongated. They are no longer flat, they are slightly pointed, like the serrated edges of a saw. I find myself staring at it longer than I should. It feels as though the family is looking at me, rather than at the camera. Entry 4, Friday, 11:52 p.m. The car is closer. I didn't think it would move, but tonight, the front bumper of my sedan is touching the heavy metal door of the elevator. It's as if the car crawled forward while I was inside the building. The photograph is now on the dashboard. The mother's smile has widened even further. Her upper lip is pulled back so far that a new row of teeth has emerged from the top of her gums, looking like tiny ivory pebbles. The son is now looking directly at the steering wheel. Entry 5, Saturday, 11:55 p.m. The car is almost flush against the door. I had to turn my head to see the front grille. The photograph is on the roof now, facing downward. The daughter's smile is the most unsettling of all. Her mouth is so wide it reaches her ears, and her teeth are starting to overlap. They look like a row of white, polished stones. When I walked past it, I felt a strange vibration in the air. It wasn't a sound, but a hum, like a low-frequency thrumming coming from the frame itself. Entry 6, Sunday, 12 a.m. The car is now perfectly centered against the elevator door. There is no gap left. The photograph is on the driver's side door. The father's smile is now so wide that his cheeks are bulging outward. His teeth are no longer just pointed, they are beginning to curve inward, like a horseshoe. The family no longer looks like they are posing for a portrait. They look like they are straining to show as much of their interior as possible. I noticed a faint smudge of moisture on the glass of the frame. It looks like a single, tiny bead of sweat. Entry 7, Monday, 12:05 a.m. The car hasn't moved, but the door of the elevator feels different. It feels closer. Or perhaps the car has merged with the door. The photograph is hanging from the rearview mirror. The entire family is now showing a full second row of teeth on the bottom. They are packed in so tightly that the enamel looks like it might crack at any moment. I heard a soft clicking sound as I walked by. It sounded like 1,000 tiny porcelain pieces tapping against one another. Entry 8, Tuesday, 12:10 a.m. The car is still there, but the photograph has changed again. It is no longer on the mirror, it is leaning against the driver's side window. The father's mouth is now so wide it occupies nearly half his face. The teeth are beginning to sprout past his lips, some curving upward, others downward. The mother's teeth have grown so many that they look like a jagged picket fence. The silence of the garage is gone, replaced by a persistent, rhythmic ticking. It sounds like a pulse. Entry 9, Wednesday, 12:15 a.m. I didn't want to come down, but the hum was pulling me. The car is still against the door, but the photograph is now lying flat on the floor mat, facing up. The family is no longer smiling in the traditional sense. Their mouths are open in a permanent, ecstatic O shape. Every single tooth is visible, gleaming in the dim amber light. The son is now looking at the ceiling, and his teeth are pointing toward the roof of the car. I felt a sudden draft, even though there was no wind. It felt like something was exhaling. Entry 10, Thursday, 12:20 a.m. I arrived at the door, and the car was gone. There were no tire marks, no dust disturbed. Only the photograph remained, sitting on the floor of the garage, perfectly centered in front of the elevator. I leaned down to pick it up. The family was no longer in the garden. They were standing in a dark hallway that looked exactly like the hallway of my own apartment. The father's smile was so wide that his face had split in two. And as my fingers touched the bronze frame, I realized the family was no longer looking at the camera. Every single one of them was looking at the spot where my head was, their teeth gleaming in a final, hungry row. When I looked closer, I saw a new addition to the photo, a small, blurry figure in the background, standing just behind the daughter, whose mouth was wide open to receive the next set of teeth. The silhouette of the still dancer. The heavy brass handle of the Great Hall doors groaned as it settled into its housing, sealing the last of the tourists outside. I stood alone in the center of the aquarium, the massive glass tanks towering like silent cathedrals. Usually, this place was a riot of bubbles and school of neon fish, but in the vacuum of the midnight hour, it felt like a graveyard of water. The only sound was the rhythmic hum of the filtration systems, a low thrum that vibrated in my chest. I walked toward the far end of the gallery, where the deep sea exhibit sat in shadow. My footsteps clicked against the wet tiles, a sharp, lonely percussion. I stopped in front of a heavy, oak-paneled door that led to the maintenance archives. It was bolted from the outside, a solid barrier of wood and iron. However, as I stood there, I noticed something peculiar in the narrow gap between the floor and the bottom of the door. A shadow was pacing. It wasn't a soft, blurry smudge. It was a distinct, charcoal-colored shape that moved with a fluid, rhythmic motion. It moved back and forth, left to right, like a pendulum. It didn't move the door itself. It moved under it, as if it were a ghost navigating a tight hallway. I froze. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a play of the overhead lamps against the textured grain of the wood. But the shadow had a shape. It was tall and slightly curved at the top, with a distinct protrusion on the left side that suggested a bent elbow. It moved with a grace that felt intentional, not accidental. I held my breath, waiting for the movement to cease. It didn't. It continued its steady, swaying gait. Then, the first sound began. It wasn't a voice, but a vibration that seemed to travel through the floorboards rather than the air. A soft, wet suction sound, like a tongue pulling away from the roof of a mouth. I blinked, my heart quickening. The shadow paused. It didn't just stop, it became perfectly still, as if it had been frozen in mid-stride. The sound of a single, heavy velvet curtain being dragged across a stone floor. I stepped closer to the door, my nose inches from the wood. I could see the shadow more clearly now. It wasn't just a shape, it had texture. It looked like velvet, deep and dense, absorbing the light around it. It was the silhouette of a dancer, a figure with a high, swept-back crown of hair and a torso that curved forward as if leaning into a breeze. But the strange thing was the wall behind the door. Even though the dancer was tucked beneath the wood, its silhouette was projected onto the wall opposite me. A rhythmic, hollow clicking, like a marble dropping into a ceramic bowl. The shadow on the wall began to change. While the dancer beneath the door remained perfectly motionless, its silhouette on the wall started to sway. It wasn't a physical movement of the body, it was a visual ripple. The shadow danced, its arms sweeping in wide, elegant arcs, its torso twisting in a slow, deliberate waltz. It was a contradiction of physics. The source was still, but the image was alive. I felt a prickle of heat on the back of my neck. The room grew colder, the water in the nearby tanks seeming to turn still and heavy. A low, humming vibration, like a distant cello string being plucked once. I reached out a trembling hand to touch the door. The wood felt icy. As my fingers brushed the grain, the shadow beneath the door suddenly lurched forward. It didn't slide, it leaped. It moved 3 inches to the right in a single, violent snap. The sound of a dry branch snapping in a silent forest. The shadow on the wall reacted instantly, its silhouette blooming outward, stretching until it reached the ceiling. The dancer on the wall was now spinning, a blur of dark velvet, while the actual dancer beneath the door remained as still as a statue. It was as if the entity was a master of 2 worlds. It held its physical form in a state of permanent poise, while its essence projected a restless, dancing spirit into the atmosphere. I should have moved, but my feet felt rooted to the tiles. I watched the shadow on the wall perform a final, dramatic leap, its silhouette stretching into a long, graceful arc, a sharp intake of breath that echoes from the center of the room. Then the movement stopped. The silhouette on the wall froze in a pose of deep reverence, one arm reaching toward the ceiling. The shadow beneath the door remained perfectly stationary. For a long moment, there was total silence. The sound of a single, heavy drop of water hitting a dry leaf. Then, the handle of the door began to rattle. Not from the outside, but from the inside. The dancer was no longer content to stay beneath the wood. It was pushing. The shadow on the wall began to shrink, pulling back toward the door as if being sucked into a vacuum. A high-pitched, crystalline ringing that fades into a hum. The door creaked open just a fraction of an inch. A sliver of darkness spilled out onto the floor. From that crack, a single, velvet-textured hand emerged. It wasn't a full hand, it was just the tips of 3 fingers, perfectly still, pointing toward me. The sound of a soft, satisfied sigh. The door swung wide with a sudden, violent thud. There was no dancer in the room, at least, not one I could see with my eyes. But the shadow on the wall was gone. The dancer beneath the door was gone. There was only the heavy door, standing wide open to the empty room beyond. I took a step back, my breath hitching in my throat. The room was silent again, the water in the tanks barely rippling. I looked at the floor where the shadow had been pacing. There was no dust, no footprints, no debris. Only the door stood open, inviting me into the dark. I realized then that the dancer wasn't hiding under the door anymore. It was standing in the room with me, perfectly still, waiting for me to notice that it was no longer casting a shadow on the wall, but was now casting a shadow over my own body. The Syncopated Sigh. The general store stood like a rotted tooth in the jaw of the ghost town, its wooden frame silvered by decades of dust. I pushed the door open, the groan of the hinges sounding more like a weary sigh than a mechanical movement. My headlamp cut a lonely yellow tunnel through the gloom, illuminating floating specks of dust that danced like tiny planets. I came here for supplies, but the silence of the town felt heavy, as if the atmosphere were pressing against my eardrums. I stepped inside, the floorboards yielding under my boots with a rhythmic, hollow thud. It was almost empty, save for rows of rusted tins and jars of preserves that had long since lost their labels. I moved toward the back, my beam sweeping over a stack of overturned crates. That was when I first noticed the flicker at the very periphery of my vision. It wasn't a shadow, but a pair of points of light, hovering just where the cone of my headlamp met the darkness. They were 2 amber sparks, wide apart. They blinked. Not at the same time, but in a staggered sequence. The left one closed, a fraction of a second before the right. It was a tiny irregularity, a hiccup in the visual field, but it made my skin prickle. I swung my headlamp toward them, but the sparks vanished. They didn't retreat, they simply ceased to be, as if they had been waiting for my attention and were offended by it. I laughed quietly, the sound feeling small in the cavernous room. Just a trick of the light, I whispered to myself. But as I moved toward a shelf of jars, the rhythm of my own body began to feel strangely deliberate. I realized I was breathing in a steady, deep cadence. Every time I exhaled, I felt a slight shift in the air pressure behind my left shoulder. It was as if the air itself was being pushed by something invisible. I stopped moving. I held my breath for 3 seconds. In the silence, I heard it, a soft, wet intake of air that didn't belong to me. It was perfectly synchronized with my own held breath, a ghostly echo of my lungs. I turned my head slowly. The amber sparks were back, positioned just at the edge of my vision. They blinked again, left then right. They were closer now. I could see the faint, velvet texture of the entity's face, a surface that looked like hammered copper, covered in fine, overlapping scales that rippled when it moved. It had no visible nose or mouth, just a series of horizontal slits that opened and closed. It didn't have a body in the traditional sense. It was a floating, oblong mass of warm, bronze-colored skin that pulsed like a slow-beating heart. It didn't have limbs, but it had a way of undulating, flowing through the air like a ribbon of silk caught in a breeze. It was hovering just behind my head, perfectly mimicking the rise and fall of my chest. When I inhaled, it expanded. When I exhaled, it contracted. I felt a strange comfort in its mimicry until I realized the timing was starting to drift. I took a sharp, sudden breath of surprise. The entity followed, but its intake of air was slightly deeper, more resonant than mine. It was starting to take over. I moved toward the front of the store, my pace quickening. The entity stayed glued to my spine, its copper scales clinking softly like 1,000 tiny coins hitting a table. Every time I blinked, it blinked in the opposite order, right, then left. The discrepancy began to unsettle me. It was no longer just following my rhythm. It was anticipating it, then overshooting the mark. I stopped again, my heart hammering against my ribs. I took a deep breath, held it, and then let it out in a long, shaky sigh. The entity responded with a sigh that was twice as long, a mournful, whistling sound that seemed to vibrate in my teeth. I realized that it wasn't just matching my breathing, it was consuming the rhythm of my life. It was stealing the me from the breath and leaving the it behind. I tried to move away from it, but it flowed with me, a shadow made of copper and breath. I reached for a tin on a high shelf, and as I did, the entity surged forward. It didn't just follow, it surged ahead of my movement. I felt a warmth on my neck, a humid heat that smelled of wet earth and old copper. I turned my head fully to face it. It was now inches from my face. It didn't have a face so much as a landscape of sensation. Its scales were vibrating, and those amber sparks, its eyes, were now wide open. They blinked, left, then right. I stood frozen. The entity stayed perfectly still, its copper skin rippling. Then, without warning, I stopped breathing entirely. I held my lungs still, my chest locked in place. For 5 seconds, the world was silent. Then, the entity took the initiative. It began to breathe for me. Its copper body expanded and contracted in a steady, rhythmic pulse, pulling air from the room and pushing it into the void of its own existence. I felt my own lungs begin to ache, longing for the oxygen it was stealing. I realized then that it wasn't just a mimic. It was a replacement. It was waiting for me to tire of the effort of living so that it could take over the motion entirely. I stood there, a statue of flesh and bone, while the bronze thing pulsed with the life I was about to surrender. I closed my eyes, and as the last of my own air left my lungs, I felt the entity's copper skin press against my cheek, its amber eyes blinking, left, then right. It let out one final, perfect breath, and for a moment, I felt the air enter my lungs as if it were being gifted by a stranger. I opened my eyes to see it hovering just an inch from my nose, its copper scales glowing with a dull, satisfied sheen. I realized that when I finally died, it wouldn't just be a memory of my breath, it would be its new favorite song. I took one last, voluntary breath, and as it left my lips, the entity caught it in its copper mouth and held it, refusing to let it go. The guest in the Flyleaf. The silence of the off-season in Blackwood Preserve isn't a true silence. It is a heavy, textured weight that presses against the ears. When the tourists depart and the hikers retreat to the warmth of the cities, the park breathes in a low, rhythmic hum. I took the ranger station as a sanctuary, a small timber cabin perched on a ridge where the pines grow thick enough to swallow the sun. For the first week, I enjoyed the solitude. I spent my days cataloging the inventory of the mess hall, and my nights curled under a heavy wool blanket, watching the shadows stretch across the ceiling. Then, on the 8th morning, I found them. At the foot of my bed sat a pair of slippers. They weren't my slippers. They were made of a thick, matted velvet, the color of crushed plums, with scalloped edges that looked slightly frayed. I hadn't owned them, and there was no one else in the cabin. I assumed perhaps I'd forgotten them from a previous season, or that the wind had tossed them from a nearby porch. I shook it off and went to make coffee. On the 9th morning, the slippers were there again. They were perfectly aligned, pointing toward the door. My heart skipped a beat. There were no footprints in the dust of the floorboards, no sign of a guest. I sat up, my pulse thrumming in my throat. "Hello," I whispered to the empty room. The air didn't answer, but the slippers remained, stubborn and silent. By the 12th day, the slippers began to change. They were no longer perfectly aligned. One was slightly turned inward. The toe of the left slipper curled as if someone were gripping the floor with their heel. It felt less like an object left behind and more like a lingering impression. I started to notice things. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. to the sound of a soft, muffled weight shifting on the floorboards, not the sharp click of a heel, but a soft, velvet thud. I decided to be brave. I stayed awake on the 13th night, my eyes fixed on the slippers. They sat in the moonlight, 2 plum-colored puddles of fabric. Just as I began to drift toward sleep, a soft sound, a rustle of fabric, broke the stillness. The slippers didn't just move, they glided. They slid toward the center of the room, then stopped. Then, a shape emerged from the corner of the ceiling. It didn't walk out of the shadows, it unfolded from them. The entity didn't have a permanent shape of its own. It was a weaver of postures. It looked like a creature made of woven wicker and wet silk, with a torso that curved like a bow. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense, but rather a cluster of smooth, pearl-like beads that shifted position depending on its mood. It moved with a strange, jerky grace, mimicking the way a human might lean against a wall or hunch over a book, but it never held a pose for more than a second. It drifted toward my bed, its body curving into a deep, elegant slouch, mimicking the way I sat when I was tired. It hovered there, its pearl beads clicking softly against one another. It seemed to be trying on my posture, molding its wicker ribs to match the curve of my spine. Then, with a sudden, fluid motion, it straightened. It mimicked the way a tall man might stand with his hands on his hips, though it had no hands, only tapered ends of silk. "Are you staying?" I asked, my voice cracking in the cold air. The entity didn't speak. It responded by collapsing into a heap, mimicking the way a tired traveler might slump into a chair. Then it surged upward, mimicking the alert, upright stance of a deer. It was a thief of motion. It stole the way we carried ourselves and wore those shapes like clothes. On the 14th night, I stopped being afraid of the slippers. I started to realize the slippers were the entity's anchor. It didn't have a self until it had something to inhabit. It borrowed my posture, but it borrowed my slippers to ground itself in my world. I woke up on the 15th day to find the slippers moved again. They were at the very edge of the bed, and the entity was standing directly above me. It had taken on a new posture. It was curled into a tight, almost spherical shape, mimicking a person huddled in a ball against the wind. But as I looked closer, I realized it was mimicking the way I looked when I was sleeping. I reached out a hand, my fingers trembling. The entity didn't recoil. It shifted its posture again, this time stretching out into a long, languid reach that mimicked the way I reached for my alarm clock. It was copying my every movement, even the ones I hadn't made yet. Then, the most unsettling thing happened. It stopped mimicking me. It stood perfectly still for a long minute. It didn't slouch, it didn't stretch, and it didn't hunch. It held a posture that was entirely its own, a strange, asymmetrical lean where its top half tilted to the left while its bottom half remained perfectly centered. It was a pose that no human could naturally hold. It moved toward the door, its posture shifting into a confident, wide-strided walk, and then it simply vanished into the shadows of the hallway. I stayed in bed for a long time, watching the plum-colored slippers. They were still there, but they were different now. They were no longer flat on the floor. They were slightly propped up, as if something were still standing inside them, even though the entity was gone. I eventually gathered my things to leave for the next station, but as I reached for my coat, I paused. I looked at the slippers one last time. They weren't just sitting there anymore. They were angled toward the spot where the entity had stood, and I realized that while it had borrowed my postures to understand how to move, it had stolen the way I felt. I stepped out into the morning air, the cabin feeling suddenly cavernous and hollow. I looked back at the bed, where the plum-colored velvet sat in the dust. I realized then that the entity hadn't just been visiting, it had been practicing. And now that it knew how to move like a human, it would eventually find a way to move like me. The Waxen Guest of Shaft 4. I found the book on a Tuesday, tucked between a collection of dry poetry and a worn manual on botany. It was a heavy, leather-bound volume of prose, but what caught my eye were the margins. They were crowded with frantic, tiny handwriting in ink that looked like dried tea. The previous owner hadn't just read the book, they had lived inside its borders. As I traced the script, I realized the handwriting changed style every 3 pages, as if different people had been whispering to the same text over decades. On the very last page, a single line was scrawled in a shaky, bold hand. "Do not forget to set a place for the guest." I laughed at the mystery of it, never suspecting that the guest was a physical presence I would soon encounter in the damp, subterranean silence of the Blackwood coal pit. I am a lover of architecture, and there is something primal about the Victorian coal pits, vast, hollowed-out veins of the earth that smell of ancient soot and wet stone. I decided to explore Shaft 4, a disused vertical tunnel that had been sealed for 80 years. Armed with a lantern and a sturdy walking stick, I descended the iron ladder into the throat of the mine. The air grew heavy, pressing against my skin like a wet wool blanket. The silence was profound, broken only by the rhythmic drip of groundwater hitting the floor. As I reached the halfway point, the temperature plummeted. The limestone walls seemed to sweat, and the scent of old coal shifted into something sweeter, something like melting honey and scorched wick. That was when I heard the first sound. It wasn't a footstep, but a soft, viscous slide, a wet shhh sound as if something heavy and soft was being dragged across the stone. I swung my lantern to the left. There, standing amidst the jagged ribs of the mine, was the guest. It was a magnificent, unsettling thing. It was a body of dripped candle wax, towering nearly 7 feet tall. It didn't have a fixed shape, yet it possessed a strange, fluid solidity. Its surface was a mottled landscape of ochre, amber, and creamy white. Most peculiar were its limbs. It didn't have its own distinct hands or feet. Instead, its arms were covered in a multitude of different hands. Some were tiny and curled like a child's, others were calloused and thick-palmed, and some were elegant with tapered tips. Every hand was a permanent impression, a frozen moment of touch. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its waxen body rippling like a puddle of thick syrup. "Who are you?" I whispered, my breath blooming in the cold air. The guest didn't speak. It drifted toward me, its many hands twitching in a chaotic, beautiful symphony. One hand reached out, a large, rough hand with a thumb slightly bent, and brushed the side of my face. The wax felt warm, vibrating with a low hum that I felt in my teeth. It was as if the guest was absorbing my very presence, recording the sensation of my skin into its own melting mass. As it moved, more hands began to emerge from its torso. I noticed that as the guest moved, the wax didn't just sit there, it flowed. A new hand began to push through its shoulder, growing from the inside out. It was a perfect replica of the hand I had used to hold the library book. The guest was mimicking me, weaving my touch into its own collection of memories. "You are the one who read the margins," the guest seemed to hum, though no voice came from its waxen throat. I felt a strange sense of belonging. The guest was a gallery of everyone who had ever reached out to touch the world and left a mark behind. It was a physical record of human contact. Yet, as the lantern flickered, the guest began to change. Its amber core started to glow with a faint, pulsing light. The many hands began to move in unison, reaching toward the walls, the floor, and me. It wasn't just a passive body anymore. It was an active collector. It moved closer, its waxen face a smooth, featureless plane of cream leaning toward mine. I realized then that the guest wasn't just a visitor. It was a hungry thing. It needed more shapes to hold. It needed more textures to preserve. It reached out with a dozen hands at once, wrapping them around my shoulders, my waist, and my head. The sensation was overwhelming. It felt like being hugged by 100 different people at once, each with a different grip, a different strength, a different history. The heat from its body began to melt the wax slightly, making it cling to my clothes like a heavy, golden coat. I felt my own sense of self beginning to blur. I wasn't just the observer anymore. I was becoming part of the collection. I could feel my own hand, the one that had gripped the walking stick, beginning to flatten and soften against its side. I took a deep breath and pushed back, trying to break the embrace. But the guest was heavy. It pulled me into its center, its waxen body molding to my frame. I saw my own reflection in the curve of its amber chest, not a perfect mirror, but a distorted, liquid version of myself. The many hands on its body were now shimmering, some of them starting to turn my own shade of skin. Finally, with a surge of strength, I grabbed the guest's primary reaching arm, a long, elegant hand, and pulled it toward my chest. The wax groaned, a sound like a stretching sheet of plastic. It relented, sliding back slightly, allowing me to stand upright. I realized the guest wasn't trying to swallow me, it was trying to incorporate me. It wanted to keep me, to hold my shape forever in its cooling mass. I backed away, my boots crunching on the grit, and ran toward the ladder. The guest didn't chase me with speed, it moved with the inevitable momentum of a landslide. It followed, its many hands waving like the tentacles of a deep-sea creature, capturing the air around it. I scrambled up the iron rungs, my heart hammering against my ribs. When I reached the top and stepped out into the cool night air, I turned back one last time. The guest stood at the mouth of shaft 4, its waxen body glowing faintly in the moonlight. It raised one hand, a new hand, still wet and perfectly shaped like mine, and waved a slow, heavy goodbye. I walked home in a daze, the scent of honey and wax still clinging to my hair. I went to my desk and picked up the library book, opening it to the last page. The handwriting was still there, but now, beneath the line about the guest, a new word had appeared in the ink, as if it had been written by a ghost. Stay. I looked at my own hand, the one I had used to hold the book. It felt slightly heavier than it had that morning, and when I moved my fingers, I could swear I heard the faint, muffled sound of wax settling into place. The appointment of the echo. The linoleum floor of the clinic was a dull, clinical beige, reflecting the hum of the fluorescent lights above. I had been sitting in chair 14 for what felt like an hour, though the clock on the wall hadn't moved a single second. It was a sprawling, architectural marvel of a waiting room. Heavy oak doors lined the walls, and a small reception desk sat at the far end, currently occupied by a desk that was completely empty. There were no magazines, no water cooler, and no other patients. Just me, my own heartbeat, and the profound, heavy silence of a building that should have been bustling with the sounds of healing. I remember checking my watch, and then checking it again, certain that the hands had frozen in a permanent, mocking mid-position. I was the only patient, yet the schedule on the wall listed 40 people before me. Then, the intercom crackled. It wasn't a sharp noise, but a wet, textured sound, like a throat clearing before a deep breath. Patient 14, the voice announced. It was my own voice. Not a recording of my voice, but my actual voice, perfectly pitched and vibrating with the exact same tremor of impatience I felt in my chest. It was as if my own throat had opened up from a distance to call my name. I sat up straight, my spine popping against the plastic backing of the chair. I waited for the door to open, for a nurse to appear with a clipboard, but the room remained still. The silence that followed was heavier than before, a thick velvet curtain of quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums. I tried to tell myself it was a fluke, a trick of the acoustics, but the intercom spoke again 3 minutes later. Patient 14, please proceed to the inner chamber. Again, my own voice. It was warm and melodic, possessing a slight rasp at the edges, the way my voice sounds when I am trying to be gentle. I stood up, my legs feeling heavy like they were moving through honey. I walked toward the heavy oak doors. They were closed, but I could hear something behind them, a soft, rhythmic thumping, like a heart beating against a hollow drum. I reached out, my hand hovering over the brass handle. Just as my fingers brushed the metal, the intercom chimed once more. Don't be afraid to enter, it whispered in my voice. It wasn't a command. It was a secret shared between two people who knew each other intimately. I pushed the door open. Beyond the door was not a room of doctors and machines, but a corridor that stretched into a hazy, golden distance. It was lined with hundreds of chairs, all occupied by figures that looked like statues. They weren't people, exactly. They were made of smooth, amber-colored wax, their features softened and rounded. They didn't move, but they all faced me as I entered. At the very end of the corridor stood a figure that made my breath hitch. It was tall, nearly 7 feet, with a body that resembled a walking cello. Its torso was a series of overlapping, iridescent scales that shifted from deep violet to burnt orange as it moved. Instead of a face with distinct features, it had a wide, smooth visor of polished copper that caught the light. Where a nose should be, there was a small, golden flute-like protrusion. It didn't have hands in the traditional sense. It had 3 delicate, curling horns on each arm, each ending in a small, glowing bulb of light. The figure moved toward me with a graceful, sliding gait. It didn't walk so much as flow across the floor. When it reached me, it stopped. It didn't have a mouth, yet the voice came from the copper visor, vibrating with the resonance of my own vocal cords. "You have arrived," it said. The voice was mine, but it carried an extra layer of depth, as if I were speaking through a cavern of crystal. I felt a strange sense of recognition. It wasn't a stranger. It felt like a version of myself that had been polished and stretched into something new. "Are you ready for the interview?" it asked. I nodded, my voice sounding small in the vastness of the corridor. "I am." I sat down on a wax chair, and the figure sat opposite me, its copper visor reflecting my own wide-eyed expression. The interview began. It wasn't a series of questions about my health or my history, but a series of questions about my presence. "How does the silence taste?" it asked. I blinked. "It tastes like salt," I replied, surprised by my own answer. "And what does the light feel like on your skin?" it continued. "It feels like a memory of a summer afternoon," I whispered. The figure hummed, a low vibration that traveled through the floor and into my bones. As we spoke, the figure began to change. The violet scales turned a deep, bruised blue, and the glowing bulbs on its horns pulsed in time with my pulse. It was reacting to my thoughts. Every time I answered a question, a new scale would shimmer. By the time we reached the final question, the figure was almost entirely blue, and the corridor had begun to fade into a soft, hazy blur. "Is there anything left to ask?" it asked, the voice now a mere breath of my own tone. I looked at it, feeling a profound sense of completion, as if the waiting room had finally served its purpose. "No," I said. "I think I understand now." The figure leaned forward, its copper visor nearly touching my forehead. It let out a long, contented sigh, my own sigh, and then it began to shrink. It didn't just get smaller, it folded into itself, the scales tucking inward, the horns curling tight, until it was no larger than a marble. It hovered in the air between us for a moment before it vanished with a soft pop. The corridor dissolved, the wax figures melted into puddles of amber light, and the golden haze evaporated. Suddenly, I was back in the waiting room. The linoleum was still beige, the lights were still humming, and the clock was still frozen. But the chair was no longer empty. Sitting in chair 14 was the tiny, marble-sized version of the figure, its copper visor gleaming. It wasn't moving, but it was watching me. I realized then that the interview hadn't been for me alone. It was a transaction. I had given it my voice, my thoughts, and my presence, and in exchange, it had given me the answer to the silence. I stood up to leave, my legs feeling lighter than they had before. I walked toward the exit, but before I reached the door, the intercom crackled one last time. It didn't use my voice this time. It was a new voice, dry, papery, and ancient. "Thank you for the loan," it whispered. I paused at the door, my hand on the handle, and realized the voice wasn't coming from the ceiling. It was coming from the marble figure in the chair. It wasn't a guest in the building, it was the owner of my identity, and it was finally ready to take my turn. The script of the sleeping dormitory. The limestone walls of the workhouse dormitory always seemed to sweat in the moonlight, weeping cold moisture that smelled of old wool and damp stone. I lay on my pallet, the rough burlap of my blanket scratching against my chin. It was the hour of the deep silence, when the heavy breathing of 40 laborers merged into a single, rhythmic tide. The air was thick with the scent of tallow and the lingering musk of exhaustion. I closed my eyes, but the darkness wasn't empty, it was textured. Every time I blinked, the shadows in the corner of the ceiling seemed to thicken, as if the soot were accumulating in layers, forming heavy, velvet curtains of gloom. I listened to the rhythmic scrape of a distant wood-cutting tool, a ghost of a sound from the yard, and the steady, low thrum of my own heart. I woke not to a sound, but to a shift in the atmosphere. The air felt heavier, more intentional. I opened my eyes to see the flock, the collective group of laborers, shifting in their sleep. They weren't just moving, they were migrating. At first, I thought they were just turning over, but then I noticed the pattern. The group of 24 people on my side of the room began to pull themselves into a tight formation. They didn't just sit, they leaned into one another, their shoulders overlapping, their heads bowed at precise angles. They were moving like a liquid, flowing toward the center of the floor. As they settled, I realized they were forming a shape. It wasn't a circle or a line. They were arranging themselves into a jagged, sprawling script across the stone floor. I squinted, my breath hitching in my throat. The bodies were the strokes of a pen. A tall man with a stooped back served as the first vertical line. A woman with her arms stretched wide became a sweeping curve. They were spelling out a name. It was a name I had heard whispered in the courtyard only that morning, though I hadn't realized its significance until now. It was my name, Is it for me? I whispered, the sound feeling like a physical intrusion into the heavy air. None of the sleepers stirred, yet the flock remained perfectly still, a human calligraphy of my identity. But as I watched, the handwriting began to change. It wasn't a static image. The bodies started to vibrate with a low, subsonic hum. The letters of my name began to lean. In the workhouse, we were taught that a letter leans toward the sun or the weight of its own body, but these letters were leaning toward the far wall, toward the heavy oak door. They leaned with a desperate, aggressive tilt, as if trying to escape the floor. That was when I saw the ink. It wasn't actual ink, but a shimmering, oily residue that began to seep from the skin of the laborers. It pulled at their feet, connecting them like wet threads. As the name leaned further, the oil began to stretch. It wasn't just my name anymore. The S of my first name elongated, its tail curling around the M of my surname like a reaching vine. The letters weren't just leaning, they were growing. They were stretching out, becoming sharper, more jagged. Suddenly, the oil began to move toward my palate. It didn't flow like water, it pulsed like a heartbeat. It crawled across the stone, claiming the space, erasing the dust. I tried to sit up, but my limbs felt heavy, as if the air itself were thickening into syrup. The flock began to move again, but this time, they were no longer forming my name. They were copying it, but they were doing it with a strange, frantic haste. Each person began to replicate the shape of the letter they occupied, becoming a twin of the original. Then, the first letter of my name, the M, began to shudder. It didn't just lean, it folded. It tipped over like a falling tower, and the oil spilled toward me. I felt a sudden, sharp pressure on my chest. I realized the name wasn't just being written on the floor. It was being projected outward. The M reached me first, its peak touching my shoulder. It felt like a warm, velvet weight. The A followed, its curve pressing against my ribs. "It's writing me," I gasped, the words barely escaping my lips. The flock was no longer just a group of people. They were a living manuscript. They were moving in a frantic, synchronized dance, rearranging themselves every few seconds. They were trying to keep up with the growth of the name, their bodies twisting into impossible angles. The oil was now a shimmering web, connecting every sleeper in the room to the letters of my name. The dormitory was no longer a room of beds, it was a page of parchment, and we were the characters being inscribed upon it. I watched as the final letter, the E at the very end of my name, reached out. It stretched toward my head, its tail hooking under my chin. The room went silent, even the breathing of the others ceased. The flock froze. The oil stopped pulsing. The name was complete, perfectly balanced on the stone floor, leaning at a sharp, beautiful angle toward the shadows. I felt a sudden, terrifying tug. The E didn't just sit there, it pulled. It began to pull my head toward the floor, as if the very ground were trying to claim my skull as its own punctuation mark. I realized then that the flock wasn't just copying my name because they were laborers, they were mimicking the thing that owned the name. The name was a tether. I reached out a hand to touch the M, but as my fingers brushed the oil, the color drained from my skin. I didn't feel the texture of a person, I felt the texture of a thought. The name was becoming solid, and I was becoming a part of the script. I felt my own body start to flatten, my bones softening like wet clay. Then, the flock moved one last time. They didn't form a new name. Instead, they all collapsed inward, their bodies folding until they were a single, huddled mass at the foot of my pallet. The oil surged forward, swallowing the last of the stone floor. The name remained, glowing with a faint, sickly light. I lay there, no longer a person lying on a pallet, but a mark on the floor. My body was the final stroke of the, slightly crooked, perfectly integrated into the flow. The silence returned, deeper than before. I closed my eyes, but I could no longer see the darkness. I was the script, and the script was still being written by the invisible hand that moved the flock. I tried to move my arm, but it was no longer a limb, it was a curve of ink. I realized with a jolt of horror that the name wasn't just my name anymore. The flock had added a tiny, final flourish at the very end, a small, sharp hook that didn't belong to my name, but to the entity that had just finished writing it. It was a period at the end of a sentence I hadn't finished speaking, and now I was the ink that would never dry. The street view of room 402. The Antarctic wind doesn't just howl here. It hums a low, vibrating note that seems to vibrate inside your teeth. Out here, at Station Borealis, the world is nothing but a vast, white desert of ice, broken only by the humming machinery of our lives. Most people think the polar night is about the lack of light, but for me, it is about the weight of the silence. It is a heavy, physical pressure that pushes against your eardrums until you start to hear things that aren't quite there. I am sitting in the mess hall, the hum of the heaters providing a steady rhythm, when I pulled up the digital archive of our base. We had installed a high-definition street view camera to map the exterior corridors during the 3-month darkness. It is a strange thing to have a permanent record of a place that feels like it is constantly shifting. I clicked on the frame from yesterday at 2 a.m. The corridor was empty, bathed in the pale glow of the overhead LEDs. But then I saw it. In the center of the frame, standing perfectly still against the frost-covered wall, was a house. Not a real house, but a perfect, miniature street view image of a Victorian cottage, complete with a chimney and a sagging porch. It looked like a piece of a dream had been pasted onto our reality. It was bizarre enough to make me lean in, but the real shift happened when I looked at the windows. Every single light in the house was on, casting a warm, amber glow that contrasted sharply with the sterile blue of the outpost. It looked cozy, almost inviting, until I realized the house was facing the opposite direction. It wasn't facing the hallway, it was facing me. I blinked, and for a second, the house seemed to pulse, like a heart beating in a chest of wood and glass. I reached for my mouse to zoom in on the front door. That is when I noticed the figure standing on the porch. It was a child, or at least, it had the proportions of a child. It had a torso that was slightly too long, with a torso that seemed to sag at the waist, and limbs that were thick and stubby rather than graceful. It didn't have the elegance of a human. It looked like a sketch made by someone who had seen a human but hadn't quite mastered the geometry of it. Its skin was the color of a bruised plum, and instead of a nose, it had a wide, flat disc of cartilage. It wasn't moving. It was just there, its oversized hands resting on the railing. I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. In the screen recording, as I moved the cursor, the figure didn't change. It was a frozen moment in time. However, the surrounding corridor remained empty. The house was an island of domesticity in a sea of industrial metal. I spent the next hour watching that single frame. I started to notice details that hadn't been there before. There was a small chair next to the child. On the chair sat a bowl of fruit. And on the wall of the house, a clock with no hands was ticking, though the image was still. I found myself whispering to the screen, "Are you waiting for someone?" It felt ridiculous to speak to a pixelated cottage, but the silence of the station made my own voice feel like a luxury. By the 3rd hour, the atmosphere changed. The house wasn't just a static image anymore. The edges of the cottage began to blur into the frost of the hallway, as if it were leaking out into our world. The amber light started to bleed onto the metal floor of the station. I noticed that the child's posture had changed slightly. It was no longer just standing, it was leaning forward, its heavy, rounded head jutting toward the front door. I felt a sudden, sharp chill. I decided to move the camera. I wanted to see what was behind the house, in the shadows of the hallway that the street view image hadn't captured yet. I dragged the frame to the left. The hallway was empty, but there was a smudge on the floor, a faint, wet streak of mud that shouldn't have been there, since we had wiped the floors an hour prior. I zoomed in again. The child was closer now. It had moved from the porch to the doorway, its wide, disc-like nose almost touching the wood. Its hands, which were thick and heavy, were now gripping the doorframe. I realized with a jolt that the child's proportions were even stranger up close. Its elbows were slightly too high, and its knees bent in directions that felt almost organic, yet slightly wrong. It wasn't looking at the porch anymore. It was looking directly at the camera lens. It was looking at me. I sat back, my breath hitching. The house felt like a doorway. It was a pocket of another world that had snagged on our own. I noticed the door of the house was slightly ajar. A sliver of gold light spilled out, and I could see a glimpse of a room inside. It wasn't a bedroom or a kitchen. It was a room filled with hundreds of tiny, identical chairs, all facing a single, empty center. And then, the most unsettling thing happened. In the next frame of the recording, a frame I hadn't even captured yet, but which seemed to manifest as I watched the child took a step out of the door. Its stubby foot hit the frost of our hallway. The house didn't move, but the child was now standing on our floor, halfway between the cottage and the mess hall table. It was still a 2D image in a 3D world, a flat layer of reality standing upright. I watched it for a long minute, mesmerized by its bruised plum skin and its strange, heavy limbs. It looked like it was trying to remember how to be solid. Then, it lifted one of its oversized hands and pointed a thick, blunt finger toward the corner of the room where I was sitting. It didn't move its head. It just pointed. A low, humming sound started to emanate from the screen, a sound that wasn't coming from the speakers, but seemed to be vibrating from the pixels themselves. It was the sound of a door opening in a house that shouldn't exist. I felt the air in the mess hall grow heavy, as if the gravity of the house was pulling on the furniture. I reached out my hand, my fingers trembling, to touch the screen. I wanted to see if the child's skin would feel like velvet or like cold stone. Just as my fingertip brushed the glass, the child did something it hadn't done in any previous frame. It opened its mouth a wide, horizontal slit and let out a silent exhale. A small puff of white mist appeared on the inside of the screen. It wasn't just a recording anymore. It was a presence. The house was no longer a frozen image. It was a lingering thought of a home, and the child was its inhabitant. I realized then that the reason the house was on our street view was because it hadn't been placed there by us. It had simply fallen out of the sky of another dimension and landed on our corridor. And now it was starting to grow. The walls of the cottage were expanding, the amber light was swallowing the blue LEDs, and the floor of the mess hall was beginning to turn into polished wood. I looked at the child one last time. It was no longer pointing at the corner. It was leaning its heavy head against the doorframe of the house, its wide nose twitching. It looked like it was waiting for me to step through. I realized then that the house wasn't just a guest in our station. It was a parasite, slowly replacing our reality with its own. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor, and looked at the corner where the child had pointed. There, in the shadows, I saw a second house beginning to form, its lights just starting to flicker on. I turned back to the screen and saw the child finally move its mouth again. It wasn't a silent exhale this time. It was a word written in tiny, golden script across the bottom of the frame. It read, "Stay." I looked back at the corner of the room, and the shadows there began to stretch toward my feet, reaching out like the roots of a tree seeking soil. The parted hair of the attic guest. I'm sitting here with my grandmother now, and she's gripping my hand so hard her knuckles are white. She wants to tell the story of the house on Willow Lane, the one we rented for 3 years. She keeps losing her place, her eyes drifting toward the ceiling as if she's watching something move in the rafters. But when she finds the thread again, she gets that same frantic twitch in her lip. She says the house was perfect, except for the closet in the master bedroom. It was a deep, oak-paneled thing, and hidden behind the hanging coats was a small, rectangular wooden hatch in the floor. It led to a crawl space that smelled of cedar and old, pressed linen. For the first month, I didn't notice it. Then, on a rainy Tuesday, I heard the humming. It was a low, melodic vibration that seemed to seep through the floorboards. It was the lullaby my mother used to sing to me, the one about the silver boat and the velvet tide. I hadn't heard it in a decade, yet here it was, vibrating in the small space beneath my feet. It was faint, like a memory trying to breathe. I sat on the floor of the closet, my heart hammering against my ribs, and whispered, "Who's there?" The humming stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise had been. I reached out and pulled the hatch open. The crawl space was narrow, barely wide enough to lie flat, filled with dust motes that danced in the sliver of light from the bedroom. At the far end, huddled in the shadows, was a person. They were sitting upright, their knees tucked to their chest. They weren't a ghost in the traditional sense. They looked solid, tangible. They wore a heavy wool sweater the color of moss. But it was their face that made my breath hitch. It was my mother's face, but not exactly. The skin was a bit too smooth, the nose a fraction too sharp, and the hair was a rich copper orange. My mother had always parted her hair strictly on the left side, a habit she'd had since she was a girl. But this entity had its hair parted on the right. It looked at me with eyes that were the color of wet river stones, wide and unblinking. It didn't speak. It just sat there, a perfect physical copy of my mother, minus the orientation of her fringe. I felt a wave of warmth wash over me, a sense of profound comfort, until the entity moved. It leaned forward, its movement fluid and slightly too fast, and reached out a hand. Its skin felt like cool silk. It opened its mouth and spoke in a voice that was a perfect mimicry of her tone, though the cadence was just a heartbeat off. "Is it time for the boat?" it asked. I nodded, tears pricking my eyes, thinking it was a miracle. I spent the next week sleeping in that bedroom, feeling the entity's presence in the crawl space. It would hum during the day, and at night, it would reach its hand out of the hatch to stroke my hair. It felt like a sanctuary. However, as the second week began, the perfection started to fray. I noticed that the entity was constantly adjusting itself. It would reach up and pull at its hair, trying to flip the part from the right to the left, then back again, as if it were trying to solve a puzzle it couldn't quite master. It was a physical manifestation of a memory trying to find its own shape. One night, I woke up to the sound of frantic scratching. The hatch was wide open. I peered inside and saw the entity standing upright, its body swaying. It looked frustrated. It was clutching its head with both hands, its copper hair falling over its face in a mess of tangled strands. "I can't find the line," it whispered. I sat up, my pulse quickening. "What line?" I asked. It looked at me, its riverstone eyes shimmering. "The line of the hair. The left, the right, the middle." It was trying to remember which side was correct. It reached out and gripped my shoulder. Its grip was firm, almost desperate. It was searching for a blueprint it didn't possess. I realized then that it wasn't just a copy of my mother, it was a copy that was still learning how to be her. It lived in the crawl space because it was a draft of a person, a sketch of a soul. The humming returned, but it was faster now, more insistent. The entity began to move out of the hatch, its moss-green sweater dragging against the floorboards. It pulled itself into the room, its movements heavy and deliberate. It stood before me, its height nearly matching mine. It looked at me with such intense concentration that I felt my own breath catch in my throat. It reached out and touched a lock of my own hair, then touched its own. It seemed to be comparing the two, measuring the weight of the strands. "You are the anchor," it murmured. "I am the echo." Then it did something that made my blood run cold. It reached out and grabbed my face, pulling me toward it. It didn't kiss me, it just pressed its forehead against mine. For a moment, I felt a strange, vibrating hum resonate through both our skulls. It was the sound of the silver boat. Then it suddenly pulled back and stood perfectly still. It looked at its hair again, then back at me. It finally seemed to settle on a choice. It pulled the hair firmly to the left, mimicking my mother's signature style. It smiled, a wide, beaming expression that was just a little too large for its face. It felt like a victory. But as it sat back down and slid into the hatch, closing the wooden lid behind it, the humming started again. It was no longer a lullaby. It was a low, steady thrumming, like a heartbeat. I lay in the dark, watching the hatch. I realized that the entity hadn't just copied my mother's hair, it had copied her essence, but it had kept her secret. I fell asleep to the sound of it humming in the dark. When I woke up the next morning, the hatch was wide open. The entity was sitting in the middle of the room, no longer in the crawl space. It was standing perfectly upright, its hair parted on the left, its moss-green sweater slightly dusty. It wasn't looking at me anymore. It was looking at the door, its body perfectly still. I walked over to it and reached out to touch its hand. It felt warm, like it had been basking in the sun. It turned its head toward me, its riverstone eyes reflecting the morning light. "I have it now," it said, its voice clear and steady. "The left side is home." It then reached out and grabbed my wrist with a strength that was slightly too much for a mere copy. It didn't let go. It pulled me toward the closet, its face inches from mine, and for the first time, it didn't hum. It just breathed. It was a deep, steady breath that sounded like it was pulling air from a room that wasn't there. I realized then that it wasn't just imitating my mother's life, it was trying to steal my space. It took a step forward, its weight shifting onto my toes. It didn't move away. It stayed there, its grip tightening on my wrist until the bones creaked. It opened its mouth to speak again, but instead of a word, it let out a long, soft sigh that smelled of cedar and old linen. It leaned in closer, its copper hair brushing against my cheek. It finally spoke the words it had been practicing all night, its voice barely a whisper. Now it is my turn to be the one who remembers. It reached out with its free hand and touched my chest, right over my heart, and I felt a tiny, sharp prick of pressure. It wasn't a heartbeat. It was a second pulse, one that wasn't mine, beginning to beat in sync with my own. It didn't move and it didn't let go. It just waited, its riverstone eyes fixed on mine. The humming started again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the entity. It was coming from the walls themselves, as if the house was finally learning the song too. I looked into its eyes and saw the truth. It wasn't a memory of my mother anymore. It was a new thing, a living thing that had finished its rehearsal. It looked perfectly content with the left side of its hair, but as it held my wrist, I noticed its other hand was beginning to change. The fingers were stretching, becoming slightly longer, and the skin was turning the color of a bruised plum. It wasn't just a copy, it was evolving. It was taking my mother's shape, but it was adding its own strange, new details. It took a deep breath and pulled me into the closet with it, the hatch swinging open like a hungry mouth. It sat me down on the floor and crawled in beside me, its moss-green sweater bunching up around its shoulders. It wrapped its arms around me, its grip firm and possessive. It rested its chin on my shoulder and closed its eyes. The humming reached a crescendo, a beautiful, haunting melody that filled every corner of the room. Then it stopped. The silence was absolute. The entity opened its eyes and looked at me, its expression one of pure, serene completion. It spoke one final time, its voice vibrating against my ear. "Do not worry," it whispered, "I will remember for both of us." It squeezed my shoulder one last time, and then its hand moved to my throat, not to choke me, but to hold me steady. It felt like a hug, but it felt like a permanent commitment. I looked at its hair, perfectly parted on the left. It was beautiful, but as I felt its heartbeat against my back, I realized that its heartbeat was getting stronger, and mine was getting fainter. It was stealing my rhythm. I could feel my own pulse slowing down, matching the steady, deliberate thrum of the thing in the closet. It was a perfect mimic, and it was hungry for more than just my memories. It wanted my very life to fill the spaces where it was still unfinished. It wasn't a ghost, and it wasn't a miracle. It was a successor. It had finished its time in the crawl space, and now it was ready to take over the room. It leaned in and whispered one last thing, its breath warm against my neck. "Stay still," it commanded. And as I felt my own body begin to go numb, I realized that the entity wasn't just copying my mother, it was replacing her, and now it was slowly replacing me. The end. Subscribe for more horror stories, and make sure to like.